There is a financial behavior that the personal finance industry promotes almost universally. It is genuinely useful. It is also completely insufficient for building wealth. And the gap between those two things, useful and sufficient, has kept millions of people optimizing the wrong variable for decades. The behavior is budgeting. And this video is not telling you to stop. It is telling you what budgeting alone will never do. Here's a question worth sitting with. Think about the most financially disciplined person you know. Someone who tracks every dollar, avoids unnecessary spending, lives well below their means, and follows every piece of standard personal finance advice consistently. Now, ask yourself honestly, is that person wealthy? Or are they simply financially careful? Because those two things are not the same. Financial carefulness is a necessary condition for not falling behind financially. It is not a sufficient condition for meaningfully moving ahead. Research on wealth accumulation, including the landmark studies conducted by Thomas Stanley and William Danko on the habits of millionaire households, published in The Millionaire Next Door, consistently shows that high spending control is common among financially successful households. But so is something else that the personal finance industry discusses far less prominently: asset ownership. Consistent, long-term investment in productive assets, not just saving more, but owning more. The distinction between those two strategies, over a 30 or 40-year working lifetime, is not a minor difference in outcome. It is the difference between a person who reaches retirement with well-managed, limited resources and a person who reaches it with a genuinely different financial position. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that gap exists, what produces it, and what the shift in strategy actually looks like in practice. Let us start with what budgeting does and what it does not. Let us be precise about what budgeting actually accomplishes. Budgeting is a tool for understanding and controlling spending relative to income. Done well, it prevents you from spending more than you earn. It creates visibility into where money goes. It identifies waste that can be redirected. It reduces the probability of consumer debt accumulation from habitual overspending. These are all genuinely valuable outcomes. A person who budgets effectively is in a meaningfully better position than one who does not. But here is the ceiling of what budgeting can produce. Budgeting optimizes the allocation of existing income. It cannot increase that income. It cannot generate returns on existing savings. It cannot produce the compounding effect that turns modest, consistent investment into significant wealth over time. Consider two people with identical incomes and identical budgeting discipline. Person A diligently budgets, spends carefully, and saves the monthly surplus into a savings account. Person B does the same, but invests the monthly surplus into a broad market index fund earning 7% annually, on average. After 30 years, the difference in outcomes between these two people is not explained by discipline. Both were equally disciplined. It is explained by what happened to the surplus. Person A has the accumulated deposits, plus negligible interest. Person B has the same deposits, compounded at 7% for 30 years, a sum that, depending on the monthly contribution, could be 3 to 5 times larger. Same income, same budget, same monthly surplus, completely different financial position at the end. Budgeting determined the size of the monthly surplus. The decision about where to put it determined everything else. Here is the implication that the personal finance industry rarely states clearly. If you are spending 40 hours tracking your coffee spending and 30 minutes thinking about where your investments are going, you are optimizing the wrong variable. The coffee tracking has a ceiling. The investment decision compounds. The ceiling and the compounding produce completely different outcomes over time, regardless of how well you execute the budgeting. Now let us look at what the research on wealth accumulation actually shows. The most frequently cited study on this question remains the work of Thomas Stanley and William Danko, whose research on millionaire households was published in The Millionaire Next Door in 1996, and has been subsequently replicated and updated in multiple follow-on studies. Their findings are worth understanding directly. The typical millionaire household in their research was not a high-income earner spending lavishly. It was a moderate to high-income earner who lived below their means, yes, but more importantly, who consistently invested a significant portion of their income in wealth-building assets over long periods. The key finding that gets underemphasized in popular discussions of this research is the investment behavior, not the spending behavior. Wealthy households in the study invested a median of approximately 20% of their income, not in savings accounts, but in investments, equities, real estate, business ownership, assets that generated returns above the inflation rate over time. The spending discipline was not what built the wealth. The spending discipline created the capacity to invest. The investing built the wealth. This distinction is critical and consistently blurred in how personal finance advice presents the findings. The takeaway most personal finance content derives from this research is live below your means. The more accurate takeaway is live below your means so that you can consistently invest the difference in assets that compound. Those are not the same lesson. One is about spending control, and the other is about what you do after spending control. Now, consider a second body of research that reframes this even more clearly. Studies on the correlation between income and wealth consistently find that income alone is a poor predictor of net worth. There are high-income people with minimal net worth, sometimes called high-income low-wealth individuals or income poor on net worth metrics. And there are moderate-income people with substantial net worth, built through consistent long-term investment rather than high earnings. The variable that predicts net worth most strongly across income levels is not income. It is the percentage of income invested in productive assets over time, not saved, invested in assets that generate returns. This finding has been replicated across different countries, different income levels, and different time periods. It is not a controversial finding among researchers. It is simply not the finding that gets prominent placement in most mainstream personal finance content, partly because it is less actionable as a daily habit, and partly because the most popular personal finance media is not optimized for long-term wealth building. It is optimized for engagement. And daily spending decisions generate more engagement than long-term investment strategy. There is a reason the latte gets more coverage than the index fund. If what we just covered explained why someone you know earns more than you, but seems no further ahead financially, stay with me. Because understanding what wealthy households actually do is one thing. Understanding why the personal finance industry consistently emphasizes spending over ownership and what the actual shift in strategy looks like in practice, that is what comes next. Here is a structural observation worth making clearly. The personal finance content industry, books, podcasts, apps, courses, influencer accounts, is a business. And, like most businesses, its content decisions are shaped by what generates revenue and engagement, not purely by what produces the best outcomes for its audience. Content about daily spending decisions generates daily engagement. Content about long-term investment strategy, on the other hand, generates a one-time read or listen, and then relatively little reason for the audience to return. This creates a structural incentive to produce content about spending, budgeting apps, frugality tips, expense tracking methods, subscription audits, and relatively less content about the boring, slow, undramatic work of consistent long-term investment. The budget app needs you to engage with it daily. The index fund, however, needs you to look at it quarterly at most. The business model of the personal finance engagement industry and the optimal strategy for actual wealth building are not well aligned. Now, consider the financial product advertising layer. The most heavily advertised financial products in mainstream personal finance media are not typically the products with the lowest fees and the best long-term outcomes for investors. They are the products with the highest advertising budgets, which correlates directly with the products that generate the highest revenue per customer for the institutions selling them. High-fee managed funds advertise heavily. Low-cost index funds, on the other hand, have smaller marketing budgets. This is not a conspiracy. It is the same economics that operate in every advertising-supported industry. The products most prominently placed in front of you are not there because they are best for you. They are there because the institutions selling them can afford to put them there. Third, the personal finance framing of spending as the primary variable keeps the conversation entirely within a domain where individual behavior change is the solution. Cut the coffee, track the spending, and budget better. This framing is convenient for everyone except the person trying to build wealth, because it keeps attention on the individual's choices rather than on the structural mechanisms we have covered throughout this channel. Inflation eroding purchasing power, tax codes favoring ownership over labor, and investment returns compounding for those who invest and not compounding for those who only save. None of these are addressed by a better budget. All of them are addressed, at least partially, by shifting from a spending focus to an ownership focus. That shift is the conversation the personal finance industry covers least, and that this channel covers most. Here is the rewritten text. The shift from a spending focus to an ownership focus looks like this in practice. It does not mean stopping budgeting. Budgeting is the mechanism that creates the monthly surplus available to invest. It means changing what the primary measure of financial progress is. It means stopping the measurement of how much you spent and starting to measure what you own. Specifically, what percentage of your income is being converted into productive assets this month? Not saved, but deployed into something that generates a return. For most people starting from a standard financial position, this means first capturing any available employer retirement match, which is the highest guaranteed return available to most workers. Then, directing additional surplus into low-cost, broad market index funds within tax-advantaged accounts, where available. Then, as capital accumulates and knowledge builds, considering additional asset classes, real estate, small business, and other income-generating investments. The specific instruments matter less than the behavior. The behavior is consistent conversion of earned income into owned assets over time. This is the behavior that research on wealth accumulation actually identifies as the primary driver. Not budget tracking, not frugality, not spending optimization, but asset acquisition consistently over long periods. The budget is the prerequisite, the investment is the mechanism, and the wealth is the outcome, not of spending less, but of owning more for longer than most people were ever taught to prioritize. Budgeting is not the enemy. It is the foundation. But a foundation is not a house. You cannot live in a foundation. The personal finance industry has spent decades teaching people to perfect their foundation while underemphasizing the structure that gets built on it. Asset ownership. Consistent, patient, long-horizon deployment of earned income into things that generate returns while you work, while you sleep, and eventually, after you stop. That is what budgeting alone will never produce. And that is what shifts the outcome. Share this with one person who has been budgeting carefully for years and still feels like their financial position barely moved. And if you want to keep understanding what actually builds wealth versus what just looks like it should, subscribe to Hidden Truth Files. Hidden no more.